to this event. When one plans this kind of an event, one doesn't really know how many to expect, but I hope you will be challenged, you will be stimulated, you perhaps might go back and share what you've heard tonight. Most of you know who I am, but for those who don't, I'm Kim Jensen. I coordinate the global concerns for our United Methodist Women, and I'm also a member of the Commission on Missions at Hennepin Avenue. Besides other things, I teach at Augsburg College, so there's lots of publicity here tonight.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Somebody with a Honda Accord.
That happens to be my husband. I'd like to make some acknowledgments here, not only to our UMW, but also to the Commission on Missions, who have helped to sponsor this event. You notice the title is Uprooted People, the response of the church and community. It's a pretty challenging topic. What do we do with it? How did the church and community respond? We're having 3 sessions tonight opening at the church, and if you do have time, tomorrow at Augsburg College. They're all free, open to you and your friends. If you feel stimulated enough, perhaps you might want to share this with your other friends. But what's the purpose of it? A book came to my desk several years ago, and this is the book. It was a desk copy, so it was free, and I could have just laid it aside. But the title was intriguing. Concentration Camps USA, Japanese Americans in World War II, by Roger Daniels. I showed this to my husband and said, "Is this true? Could this have happened in America?" And he quietly nodded and said yes. And so began the search. What is this? Because I took a master's degree in American history, took several more courses beyond that in American history, and not one of my professors spoke about this. For those who probe deeper into my background, you'll find that I don't look Japanese, some think I am, but I'm Burmese. And I went through the Japanese occupation. So what am I doing with this topic? Shouldn't I be bitter because I suffered for 4 years, lost everything? But here's someone who drove all the way from Madison, Wisconsin today. She doesn't know what I'm going to say. Thrown on this large campus, a foreign student, just the 2nd year in America, I was invited to her home for Thanksgiving meals, for Christmas meals, and when I was engaged and my husband-to-be came down, I said, "May I have my fiancé coming?" She says, "Bring him." Here is a role model who healed the wounds, and then meeting others like Joe, Ty, and a few more new friends amongst the Japanese American community, and those amongst you who are sitting here, wonderful supporters, have made me feel that no matter how badly I had been hurt during the war, this also was a hurt that people should know about, that some of our participants will be sharing tonight. But first, I'd like to recognize in the group here our chairperson for the Missions Commission, and our minister, who is our advisor and a good role model. He's new to the commission, but lots of spark. First, Ruth, I'd like to have you up there to be recognized, Ruth Ushall. And then we have Reverend Jim McChesney.
Thank you, Dr. Jensen. Welcome, Hennepin Avenue Young Methodist Church. I really affirm what you're doing here, King Ken, and we're behind you 100%. Getting to know another person takes down all the barriers that keep us apart in those pains. I lived in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and I was 5 years old at Pearl Harbor time. And my father, to show you what hysteria does to people, sold our home in Tulsa and moved us way out in the country because he was so afraid that any day the Japanese would be in California. Now, isn't that absolutely ludicrous now in the fish of history and all the kinds of hysteria? And we just thank the world of you for helping us look at our history and even our weaknesses so that God's name be praised. And I certainly bring a blessing to the staff and the people in the church who say, God bless you with this great understanding of human relations for all of us.
Thank you, Jim. I'd like to recognize a few other sponsors in the group. There are several members from my circle here, United Methodist Women. Thank you, members, for coming, the wonderful support. For the Commission on Mission members and friends and a co-sponsor of this conference, some Delta Kappa Gamma members here. A conference like this cannot be put off and running, as they say, unless we have a number of good supporters. And I've learned through the years to network amongst certain friends who might be interested in this kind of thing. And this is what energizes me to do what we're doing tonight. We have some wonderful group of participants, and I think I will introduce them as they go along. Our theme here, Uprooted, Response of the Church, may bring varied responses from our group. You may agree with them, or you may disagree, but that's their story, and we need to hear it. And before I let them come before you, may I just point out to you that all this equipment you see, two of my students, John and Dean, and several other students are in the audience, but John and Dean are responsible for videotaping today's session and tomorrow's sessions, so that we will have it not only for Hennepin Archives, but for the Augsburg Archives and any other interested person. And so we'll start. Joe, would you like to start first? But let me just introduce you. For those of you who are at Hennepin, Joe, of course, is a familiar face. He comes to us, in case some of you do not realize, from a very distinguished background. Delta Kappa Gamma, Phi Beta Kappa, not Delta Kappa Gamma, Phi Beta Kappa, a graduate of Columbia University in terms of his PhD. He did his undergraduate work in Denver. He was born out on the West Coast. He has several distinguished publications as well as fellowships. Those of you who know the name Danforth Fellow know that this is a pretty prestigious honor to have. And I've come to know Joe through the years. Seeing him in May one day in the corridor upstairs, I told my husband, here's a new face, because I look different, and I always look for different faces other than Caucasian. And I sort of went up to him and introduced me. He must have thought I was pretty bold or something. But I tend to do that kind of thing, and if you knew me in 1950, I wouldn't do it. So I've been acculturated. Let us welcome Joe. Joe, you can come and there's the mic that's
I'll stand because I can't be seen if I sit. That's a cultural problem. I'm really going to talk about my father because I was not, if you grow up in Denver, Colorado, you weren't interned. And so I have none of that experience except what I get from my wife. But I have a few comments to make about the other side from looking at it from one who is not interned. Come, ye blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was an hungered, and you gave me meat. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you took me in. naked, and ye clothed me. I was sick, and ye visited me. I was in prison, and ye came unto me. Verily I say unto you, inasmuch as ye have done it unto one of the least of these my brethren, ye have done it unto me. About 100 years ago, my father, a lad of about 16, came to America, the promised land, the land of the free, the home of the brave, where liberty, equality, and fraternity reigned, a land of milk and honey, where gold lay on the streets in the hills of California, where the poor, oppressed, huddled masses of the world came to be free to partake of the manifest destiny of mankind. My father believed every word, converted to Christianity, graduated from Willamette University, the Kimball College of Theology, was ordained into the Methodist ministry, and upon marrying a Christian teacher from Japan, began his 37-year ministry in Spokane, Washington in 1913. In 1920, he moved to Portland, Oregon, with wife and 3 children, and in 1929, with the same wife and 4 more children, he moved to Denver, Colorado, where he remained throughout the war. When I was a lad of 15, on Sunday, December 7, 1941, my father had just preached on the above text in the anticipation of the Advent holidays, both in English and in Japanese, as was his habit when Pearl Harbor happened. Of course, I'd always felt like a stranger in a strange land, for after all, I was the only boy in a family of 8 with 7 girls. I was the only Japanese child in the entire neighborhood that I know of, and there were only about 300 Japanese in the city of Denver. Little did I realize that I would feel stranger and stranger as time went on. The fun, one must, of course, understand the nature of the Japanese immigrant Christian church in the U.S. It was, in the first place, strange to be a Christian among Japanese immigrants. To be normal, one must have been a Buddhist. A Christian was rather selling out culturally. But as Americanization progressed, many native-born became Christian, and sometimes even with a strange vengeance. Another thing about being Japanese and Christian, the Protestant denominations divided up the non-coastal western states by what was called a comity agreement. So Idaho and Utah, you ought to find this a bit funny, belong to the Presbyterians. Wyoming and Colorado belong to the Methodists. New Mexico to the Baptists. Montana to the Congregationalists. From Omaha east to Chicago, quite a territory, including Minnesota. The Episcopalians were in charge. And New York became, oddly enough, Dutch Reformed. Now, as variegated as Japanese, these are the only ones who would cooperate and understand. As variegated as Japanese coastal Christianity was, Denver Christianity among the Japanese was Methodist Episcopal, as it was called in those days, with Methodist class meetings, as they were called, in Brighton, Fort Lupton, Greeley, Fort Collins, Colorado Springs, Littleton, Pueblo, Rocky Ford, Los Animas on the eastern slope, Grand Junction on the western slope, and Hanna and Cheyenne in Wyoming. Of course, the only real church building was in Denver, using a building that was, as fate would have it, formerly a German Methodist church. The Wyoming meetings were at Cheyenne and Hanna, and Dad created another meeting at Sidney, Nebraska, of all places. He was a real circuit rider and a traveling elder. When the war broke out, Dad had been in Denver for 12 years, serving the Japanese Methodist Episcopal Church, and that's what it was called, at 25th and California Street, And with a name like that, the church was a sitting duck for wartime vandalism. And just as it happened in the First World War, the stained glass memorial windows of the old German Methodist, now Japanese church were destroyed by rocks, doors and woodwork by hatchets. And happily, Dad's long association with the Denver Ministerial Alliance and the Council of Churches raised the appropriate funds to replace, with wartime replacements, the windows, doors, and some of the furniture of the church. Harold Gilmore, Executive Secretary of the Council of Churches, Dean Paul Roberts of St. John's in the Wilderness, that's what they call the Episcopal Cathedral in Denver, Samuel Marble of Trinity Church, Methodist, Martin Anderson, Presbyterian Church, longtime ministerial friends came to our assistance to help with the restoration of our modest little church over the next few years. We, of course, were an ethnic church, vulnerable for our lack of assimilation into the community, but language came first, and racists had their fun. But it was the churches of Denver to whom we turned always for help, and I know that Dad and Mom were eternally grateful. The normal harassments of the war were bad enough. Our cameras and radios were confiscated by the FBI. They even took my box camera. Our movements were restricted within 20 miles. Our curfews of 8 and 10 p.m. were installed. But for a minister, of course, such regulations were intolerable. But inasmuch as it threw Dad into immediate contact with Attorney General Charles Clayton Morrissey and Governor Ralph W. Carr, it had its blessings. For Dad had to get special permission to travel his parish, you understand, all over Colorado, Wyoming, and western Nebraska. So when President Roosevelt's order for the evacuation of War Zone 1, agreed to by such great liberals as Walter Lippmann, Earl Warren, and implemented by General DeWitt occurred, it is a curiously reported fact that Colorado was the first state to, quote, open up for evacuees. And no one ever seems to know why. Not loud enough. That's a strange fact. I know, of course, because it was Dad who had the ear of Governor Carr, who had explained to him that Issei could not be naturalized by law, and the Oriental Exclusion Act of 1923 and the Alien Land Laws had discriminated wildly that nothing could be done against the Japanese, and that he and Attorney General Morrissey had little to fear from these citizens and their parents who had been dispossessed from the West Coast. But being the first state to be opened up to evacuees was also a very mixed blessing. For beginning with voluntary evacuation and proceeding through the end of the war, a large number of people we never even knew proceeded to land every day on our church doorsteps. From spring 1942 right through June 1947, when Dad moved to Fresno, California, we knew hardly a day when there weren't a family or two seeking immediate food, shelter, and a job there on our front porch. The church became a dormitory and a soup kitchen. And when our facilities were exhausted, our parishioners' homes were invaded. When those gave out, the other churches in the community were enlisted for similar purposes. In the next 2 or 3 years, our table, which had always, understand, fed a family of 11, plus at least a seminary student or two, now regularly fed 18 to 20 people routinely and at every meal, including families, and when families got settled, it was students until the end of the war. There are, of course, many things I shall never understand, and one of them is how it is possible for such things to happen on the most impecunious income of a modest Methodist preacher. I know, of course, that my mother was an ingenious woman, and that my sisters and I were called upon to do chores beyond all possible reason. Nevertheless, I sit in rapt amazement when I recall all that was done and endured. I know that one of the worst days of those years was when my dad said that the war and Christian obligations were too much for my sister, who died of exhaustion and meningitis. She was just 18, in the peak of her idealism. Nevertheless, I have to admit that it was the churches to whom we usually turned in those dark days. The persons who ran the councils of churches, the ministerial alliance, the names read like a litany of my permanent friends: Harold and Iris Gilmore, Ben and Hazel Christner, Dean Paul Roberts, Martin Anderson and his daughter Margaret, Sam Marble, Otto Hauser, Floyd Sampson, Fred Cox, Rufus Baker, and 100 others, and many at personal cost to themselves. It was to the church and the church colleges, too, to whom we automatically turned for help in the relocation effort. And you know and I know that many colleges and many churches responded with generosity and charity. I must confess that even after 40 years, I still often feel like a stranger in a strange land. I'm still asked once in a while, how do you like our country by now? Even after 100 years. But I've also learned, perhaps from my Christian friends, that on earth we have no abiding place. And maybe I've finally learned that we are always young strangers and sojourners. And as Augustine would have reminded us, in quietum est cor nostrum, donec requiescat in te, we only find rest in thee. And we must no longer chafe at any alienation. But every time I think of December 7th, 1941, I can still hear my father's soft-spoken voice reading his text for the day. Come, ye blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungered, and ye gave me meat. I was thirsty, and ye gave me drink. I was a stranger, and ye took me in. Naked, and ye clothed me. I was sick, and ye visited me. I was in prison, and ye came unto me. Then shall the righteous answer him, saying, Lord, when saw we thee hungered, fed thee, thirsty, gave thee drink? When saw we thee a stranger, and took thee in, or naked, and clothed thee? Or when saw we thee sick, or in prison, and came unto thee? And the king shall answer and say to them, Verily I say unto you, inasmuch as ye have done it unto the one of these, the least of these, my brethren, ye have done it unto me. And for some strange reason, this has always been the essence, must always be the essence of the church's response to uprooted people. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. I think you've touched all of us in many different ways. And as you speak of your father, my father haunted me because on that particular day he had just left, just a week, to go from Burma to India for medical treatment, and I never saw him again. So we all have some stories, and I'm glad we could hear yours. Gladys will be our next speaker. She also has a very, very interesting story to share with us. My students were particularly excited when they saw her name appear on this program. They said, can we studied about her last spring, because I used a book that one of the professors sitting in the audience from the University of Minnesota had put together. Gladys, of course, grew up in California like a lot of Japanese Americans, but she has quite a unique story to tell, Some of it perhaps she'll share with you, but perhaps you can also read about it. She has a PhD from the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor, majoring in Far Eastern Studies. She did her master's at Chicago University in International Relations, and it was there that someone asked her, possibly, perhaps she can share who it is, why are you studying international relations? A big why, because she's Japanese American. And she did her BA at Washington University in St. Louis. She and her parents lost quite a bit during the war, and Gladys, I can empathize with that, although it's in a different way. Today she teaches at River Falls, a professor of sociology, and I welcome you and thank you so much for being a part of this, because she couldn't participate tomorrow since she teaches Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Welcome. Would you like to sit or come?
I'm going to give you some of my personal experiences of myself and my family. Before the evacuation, I lived with my widowed mother and two brothers on a 180-acre farm called Winifred Orchards, growing peaches, apricots, and grapes. My father owned some 55%, and his Caucasian lawyer owned something like 45%. My father died on November 6th of 1940, and therefore his estate was in probate for a year or so. The war broke out just as my mother and her three minor children, ages 17, 16, and 14, were adjusting their lives to the loss of the breadwinner and the necessity to settle the disposition of Winifred Orchards. A few hours after the news of Pearl Harbor, my father's Caucasian attorney paid an unscheduled visit to my mother, demanding that she destroy certain papers that connected the Ishidas with the ownership of Winifred Orchards. He clearly stated then that my Issei mother was now an enemy alien with no rights, and that the children were minors and had no legal rights, especially without a guardian. Of course, his statement left us feeling extremely insecure, baffled, and frustrated. We could no longer depend on him or trust him. He was my father's attorney for all those years, but he could no longer be our legal representative. However, we still had to negotiate with him for the land that my father had worked so hard to acquire. Our family could not lose the land without a fight. From the advent of World War II, my father's Caucasian attorney persisted in harassing my Issei mother. Between February 1941 and the evacuation of the Japanese Americans in April of 1942, there were meetings to determine the disposition of the orchard. In trying to terminate the joint interests in Winifred Orchards, the attorney in April 1941 offered a price to either buy or sell the respective interests. My mother, as a Japanese ineligible for citizenship, was prohibited by the Alien Land Law of California from even considering possible purchase of the attorney's interest. She had no choice but to accept whatever he might offer for her equitable ownership. Under these circumstances, my mother was unable to refuse his offer. She had no other options to exercise in the transaction. At no time were there fair negotiations. Excuse me. Through this transaction, my father's attorney took advantage of the widow's status as an ineligible alien. he denied her the right to bargain with him, thereby acquiring her equitable interest in the properties without fair consideration. Indeed, my East Bay mother was represented by counsel. However, they all advised her to take what my father's attorney offered, because the Ishidas were in an untenable position. Thus, the heirs to the Ishida property were denied something that was a book value of agricultural investment in 1942, which was something over $82,000. On February 19, 1942, Executive Order 9066 was announced over the media. It was also in February that the Ishidas were paid the paltry sum of $16,500 for their 55% portion of Winifred Orchards. Even before the settlement, my father's attorney in January of 1942 took title to Winifred Orchards in himself. This happened prior to any payments to my mother. Before this period, my father's attorney had not invested a penny, only a promissory note which represented his 45% interest. These notes were never paid. In the settlement, only the land was considered. Inventories of farm equipment such as tractors, truck, car, fertilizer, and other supplies were not included in the final accounting. 2 years later, in 1944, Winifred Orchards was sold for $83,000 plus an inventory of something over $8,000. Quite a neat profit. From the fall of 1940 through the spring of 1942, I was a student at Modesto Junior College. I still remember vividly the curfew laws that were imposed on us. We persons of Japanese ancestry had to be home by 8 p.m. As I reached my second-floor apartment and looked out the window, the FBI agents were already out there. Why the curfew? This law was a restriction of our liberty. It was imposed on the Japanese for no cause. After we received our paltry payment, we were evicted from our residence, which had been home for all of my life. Fortunately, friends came to our rescue and rented us an apartment for the 2 months before evacuation. In the meantime, rumors and newspapers reported the possibility of the internment of all Japanese, aliens and citizens alike. That to me was incredible. It was absolutely a numbing experience. Our family discussed the possibility of voluntary evacuation. But then we began to hear stories about the difficulty of purchasing gasoline. There were people who simply refused to sell gasoline to Japanese. Our family decided that a widow with teenage children could encounter problems that we could not cope. The world out there was indeed hostile. It would be sensible to evacuate with the group. As a citizen and the oldest child, I felt perfectly capable of caring for my younger brothers should the government take my alien mother. In my naive way, I thought that aliens could perhaps be incarcerated, but surely not citizens. By April of 1942, all Japanese aliens and Japanese Americans in the Modesto area in Stanislaus County, California, were evacuated to the Merced Assembly Center under the jurisdiction of the Wartime Civil Control Administration. Sometime in late August of 1942, I went with the advance crew from the Merced Assembly Center to the Amachi concentration camp in Granada, Colorado, since I anticipated being released to Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri. Amachi was a desert, with numerous windstorms. The tar-papered barracks were hardly any protection from sand and dust. My youngest brother suffered from asthma, and this environment was hardly the place for him. Miserable as he was, he survived. Fortunately, our family had one room assigned to us, which provided privacy. Within a month, however, after our arrival at Amachi, my brother and I were released to matriculate at Washington University in St. Louis. We were finally free to attend the university, no longer incarcerated. My Issei mother insisted that her children continue their education. She never complained about camp conditions or being lonesome. She stayed in the camp and waited out the war years in spite of all kinds of miseries. What sacrifice these same made for their children. She was one of the last ones to leave the camp and relocate to Chicago, where she still resides. Another violation of my civil liberties took place when I matriculated at the University of Chicago. I was interrogated by the FBI for an hour. He wanted to know why I wanted to major in international relations. His line of questioning implied something sinister, which certainly was not in my psyche. I was out of camp and supposedly free, but I was not out of the woods yet. I certainly resented this interview. Did I not have the right to select a course of study that I thought that I would enjoy and was involved in? Finally, I must conclude that deep-seated racism affected our laws, that is, United States laws, people's attitudes, and irrational government decisions and actions. In my family's case, we were caught in a conflict of interest and conflict of laws, which resulted in loss of land that my father has spent his lifetime to accumulate. He had turned a hayfield into a beautiful fruit orchard and a vineyard. It was the acquisition of property that was a fruition of his dream as a young boy from Kyushu, Japan. To have the kind of fruit orchard we had and left behind would probably cost $500,000 in today's inflated economy. This monetary redress would be meaningful to my Issei mother, who still survives. Should it materialize, she certainly would be gratified with her life complete, that her husband's labors were not in vain. The other thing that I'd like to comment on is the fact that through the national student relocation, the Japanese American students were able to relocate from the various camps to the Midwestern and Eastern colleges and universities. For that, I'm very grateful, as many of the Japanese American students are grateful, to the American Friends Service Committee and some of the Quakers in Philadelphia. The executive secretary at that time took on the leadership of relocating some 5,000 Japanese American students, for which I think we are all very grateful. These are the students who did not necessarily spend their years in the relocation centers like my mother did, and for which all of us, I think, in receiving our education are forever grateful. There's some of the other churches, church-related colleges also were one of the first to accept the Japanese American students. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gladys, for your story. I think many church-related colleges in the Twin Cities were very, very receptive. University of Minnesota, as some of you, had to be a little more cautious because they had defense agreements and they weren't able to accept some of these students. The next speaker, Ty, is one of those students. I came to know Ty about 1 or 2 years after I came to Minnesota from Madison after we were married. And again, something drew me to her through another friend, because some of you who don't know that I was not born Methodist. My mother was Buddhist, my father was Anglican, and now I'm Methodist, but I come out of Baptist roots, so I'm really ecumenical. But Ty has Baptist roots. It was always with her, and her story is something that perhaps the Baptists did help in some way during her traumatic experiences. She has an AB degree from Denison University. She'll tell you how she got there. She has a Master's of Religious Education from Andrew Newton. Some of you who know that very good institution will know why a graduate from that institution couldn't get a job after one of the few women went there. Well, that's another story also. So, having been challenged in that way, she went on perhaps to do something else. If women couldn't get jobs that they wanted in the religious arena, perhaps social work would be something. So she has a master's in social work from the University of Minnesota. I think I've tantalized you enough, so Ty will share the rest.
On December 7th, 1941, I was a student at Los Angeles City College waiting to transfer to the University of Redlands, an American Baptist-related school. It's just in the recent years that I'm willing to talk about that because I'm old enough now that I'm not embarrassed to admit that I was already a college student in 1941. This arrangement for transfer was being made through the efforts of the Baptist student worker on the Los Angeles City College campus and my Bible teacher, both of whom felt that the situation on the West Coast was not conducive to learning, and so they were doing all they can to help me get away from the West Coast. So I transferred to the University of Redlands, which is a little inland from where I live. But very shortly after I started at Redlands, the orders started coming down where anyone of Japanese ancestry was prohibited from travel. My home was in Gardena, which is not very far from the Pacific coast. And prior to the travel ban, my sister helped my parents to move to Salt Lake City, which was considered sufficiently inland so that the possibility of sabotage was not as likely. By the time my sister returned from Salt Lake City, the travel restrictions had been increased so that her family could no longer join my parents, which is what they had planned to do. So they were stuck in Gardena, and I was stuck at Redlands, confined on the campus, separated from my family. And I hadn't been at Redlands very long, so I didn't know very many people either. In May, I was evacuated with the other Japanese students to the Poston Relocation Center, which is located in the deserts of Arizona, and which is also on an Indian reservation. This was one of the first centers that was open, and when we arrived, it was still under construction. So those of us who were there at that time, many single bachelors who were brought in early to help build the barracks that we later occupied. At this stage, most of the people evacuated were still confined in the assembly centers, as was mentioned earlier. And in the case of my brother and sister, that was the Santa Anita racetracks where they lived in the horse stables. After 4 months of red tape, I was able to join my parents in Salt Lake City, where I stayed until I could go to Denison University in Granville, Ohio, another American Baptist-related college. The clearance took too long for me to make the fall semester, So I had to wait until January to continue my disrupted education. En route from Salt Lake City to Granville, Ohio, I traveled by bus. And when I crossed the Kansas-Missouri border, I was awakened in the middle of the night and had to show my travel papers. As I recall the incident, my memory is that this was in an isolated rural area, not even a regular bus stop. After 4 months behind security fences with guards monitoring our activities, you can imagine the emotions that I went through. Thinking that I might just be put off the bus in the middle of the night in the middle of an area that was unfamiliar to me. For a young woman who'd never traveled alone, to say nothing of going out of my own state, it was quite a traumatic experience. And all I can say is, it's a lucky thing I was young, because somehow youth is adventurous and can bounce back from traumatic experiences. Well, similarly, the 4 months I spent in Poston, I lived it out as a drama and an adventure. At that stage in my life, I was caught up with my newly found Christian faith, and I was preparing myself for Christian service. So I associated this sojourn as similar to the Jews in the Old Testament wandering around in the wilderness. Now, in retrospect, I guess I have to admit that I lived with the assurance that my church friends on the outside were using all their influence to get me out, so there was the expectation that my stay would be very brief. Now, had that hope not been there, my adventurous spirit might have wilted. But fortunately, I was released after 4 months. As I indicated earlier, I had been evacuated with my fellow students. 2 of us were single women, and the camps were not prepared at this stage to accommodate us, so we were assigned to live with the one Japanese family from Redlands. Redlands was not a community that had many Japanese, and so the teenage son in that family where we were assigned was not used to living intimately with Japanese. Between being separated from his friends at home and being forced to live with a cultural group he was not very familiar with was a very difficult adjustment for him. One day he was found hanging from the rafters in the mess hall with a butcher knife in his hands, threatening to kill anyone who came near him. Now, the only thing that separated us, this other female student and I, from this young man in our one-room living unit in the barrack was an army blanket that we had used as a divider. Eventually, he had to be removed, but you can imagine the feelings of that family who could not hide from the community this unfortunate event that they considered a shame and a disgrace. On the whole, I can't say that I personally suffered severe damage from the evacuation experience. Although the family was uprooted but we were fortunate that the pastor of our church was able to watch over our material goods, renting out our house and seeing that damage did not occur. And it may be that I might not have been able to have the benefit of all the educational opportunities that came my way had the evacuation not occurred. However, I am aware that I was one of a very small group that was so fortunate. And even within my own family, my sister's family and my brother's family, the experience was quite different. Kinkin made reference to the fact that after graduating from seminary, I returned to California because by that time my family had returned to our home in Gardena. And if you could imagine, it was bad enough that a young Japanese woman would even go to college, to say nothing about going to graduate school or seminary, and then to come home because she couldn't get a job. It was quite a humiliating experience. Fortunately, one of my professors happened to be lecturing in Hawaii that summer, and he became aware of a Japanese congregational church. And so eventually I was offered a job in Hawaii, but it had to be a Japanese church. The one interview I had for a church was in Montana, and I didn't answer the questions right, and so I didn't receive a call. I'm not sure if that was the only reason, because just a few years before that, I had spent a summer on the Crow Indian Reservation in Montana, and it was the one time I was asked to leave a swimming pool. I was aware that when I went there was quite a lot of discussion between the lifeguard and the person at the ticket taker. And I think the debate was Indians weren't permitted in the swimming pool, and they weren't sure whether I was Indian or not, but they decided that I shouldn't be permitted. So it's not surprising to me that I come along a year later and the Church of Montana did not invite me. But I have to admit that personally, I did not experience the hardships that many Japanese experience, and some of it I had to read in the books. And when I go back to California to visit, and I talk with some of the people I knew in my younger days, I realize the bitterness and the hurt that these people are still experiencing. Thank you.
I think you've heard the college student experience, and now we will turn to someone who was a teenager and graduated from a high school in one of the relocation centers or the camps or whatever you care to call it. He is Sam Honder, and Sam, of course, is still working for 3M. You notice in the selection of participants, we try to mix academia with community and business, hoping that you would get a varied background of people sharing their thoughts with you. Sam was in the camps in Arkansas for 2.5 years. He is very active on the redress committee. I have an assortment of books. I just brought a few from my library collection here. And this summer there was quite a bit on the redress issue. There's a cartoon out there that the Minneapolis Tribune ran with the American flag trying to erase something on it. Can you erase that with any kind of monetary funds? So take a look at that. And Sam is involved with the Redress Committee here in Minnesota, also with the Japanese American Citizens League. His family had a disrupted life like most others, and I did not meet Sam till tonight. I just talked to him on the phone. So I'm making a lot of new friends, learning a lot of things, and I hope you are too as he shares with us.
That's right. I was only 15-year-old when I went into camp. I've got a little different experience, maybe a little different view. I was sent to Jerome, Arkansas, and because I was 15-year-old, we couldn't work. There was no school at that time, so what do? All we did is roam the camp, raise a little hell here and there. We used to always give the MPs a lot of trouble. I remember one night, well, before that anyway, we used to always go in gangs and follow the MP that was marching back and forth in between the two fences. And one of those, I was just calling those names and all the time, so we decided we would fix him one night, and he was up in the towers. It was about 12 o'clock in the evening. A bunch of us all had rocks in our hand, and we all, at the signal, we threw the rocks, and we knocked every window out of that tower, including the searchlights. But within 15 minutes, there must have been about 30 MPs that came out there. was dragging all the head of the family out of the barracks, including my father. They knew who did it. But by the time the MPs got here, there was about 200 of the Japanese surrounded the MPs. And luckily, there wasn't any killing or any problem, because, boy, I would have really got it. But the next day, the leaders of the community or the camp got all of us kids together and really tore into us. Now, there are other things that we did in camp, but I'm not going to talk too much about that. But our family of 6 stayed in the room 20 by 25, and it got so unbearable at times that I just had to leave and just go to the laundry room. Many a time my mother would come out there about 11 or 12 o'clock in the evening and tell me, come back in. So sort of a rule was that when you become 17-year-old, you could leave the camp on your own. Otherwise, you had to stay with your family. But there was a catch there. You had to sign a questionnaire. And one of the questions was that, will you stop swearing allegiance to the Emperor of Japan? And the other one was, are you willing to serve in the armed forces of the United States? Well, those questions didn't bother me too much, but it bothered a lot of people. But I wanted to leave camp. So when I was 17, I went to the office and signed yes, yes, and I got to leave. I was given $75 plus a train fare to Cleveland, Ohio. Now, I haven't talked too much about the camp for a number of years. In fact, until about 1968. My daughter came home from school one time, from junior high school, and she asked me, what did I do, or what did my father do, while we were put in camp? I told her we didn't do a thing. It was unjustified. But she said there must have been some un-American activity going on in the Japanese community, or our country would never do such a thing. And I told her, where did she learn all this stuff? She said she had it in a book. It had one paragraph or one sentence that we were put in camp because of military necessity. I went to school there and talked to the teacher. And he told the students that there was a possibility of sabotage performance by the Japanese community. I said, no. And I talked to the superintendent of the school, and I asked him to get those books out of the school. And he said, he kind of agreed with me that it was wrong, but he would not get the books out, but he would never order another book that said it was military necessity. But I got to thinking a lot about this, and I thought, there must be other children, a third generation, thinking the same thing. So in 1970, we were pressuring the Japanese American Citizen League to do something about it. So they came out with a resolution that would, this was in 1970 now, they would go after some sort of redress. In 1972, we have a convention every 2 years. There's a committee formed. They didn't have anything to report. 74, they told us they ran out of money. In 76, they did some research. And by then, they got another committee. In 1978 now, the Japanese American Citizen League passed a resolution that we would go after $25,000 per internee. That's when the editorials started coming out. Some were good, some were real bad. Especially the one that came out and says, why should we pay them that they started the war? I read one from the Indianapolis paper that said that the Japanese came to America in thousands in 1930, and they quickly became American citizens, and they had things all planned out. But our government was too smart for that. But he was wrong. He just wrote lies about those things. He's wrong in 2 cases. Japanese could not come to the United States in the 1930s because there was the Oriental Exclusion Act in 1924. Besides that, Japanese could not become American citizens until 1952. Well, we had a little problem with this. You know, it's all right to say that we're going to go after $25,000, but who's going to give it to us? We talked to some of the congressmen. I guess it all ended up as this. Okay, give us proof that there was any wrongdoing. So this is when we started. We asked to form this commission to look into the evacuation. And this commission came out a report about a year ago and said it was unjustified. It was all based on racial prejudice. And they came out a recommendation. They came out and recommended $20,000 per internee. Now, last July, there was a bill that was introduced in Congress by Alan Cranston and Mark Lowry of Washington. Now, the Japanese American Citizen League is not supportive of this bill. This bill states that there's $20,000 per internees, but there was one problem in that thing, and they were asking $20,000 for everyone who was in camp. That's included someone who died in 1945. Now this is going to be a big problem. Someone died in 1945, and who is going to get this money? So the Japanese American Citizen League approached Jim Wright, who's the majority leader of Texas. And we are going to come out with another bill sometime this month, and Jim Wright will introduce this bill. And this bill will be asking for $20,000 per internee. It would include my father, the East Side, first generation, regardless whether they were, technically they were enemy aliens, but they were permanent residents, and they will be first to receive the money if the bill is passed. And this bill does not include the heirs. So this would include about 60,000 survivors of the camp. I believe one of the number one problem that people have with us, the Japanese Americans, it's hard for them to understand that we are Americans. When the commission came out with their recommendation, I was asked to go on television on WCCO News, and I was on the 5 o'clock news. They mentioned my name, where I was from, White Bear Lake. As soon as I got home, I got a telephone call. The guy told me that I have to pay for Pearl Harbor first before I get any kind of compensation. And I was trying to explain to them that I was an American, and he just couldn't believe it. He says, yes, I told him my father was Japanese, my mother was Japanese, but I was born here and I'm American. But that still didn't sink into him. Then I got another call. They thought that they should pay the survivors of the Bataan March first, and I was trying to ask them, this is a different situation, and that we are Americans. I was just trying to explain to them that we were born here, that there was no charges, no hearing, no trial, anything. We were just picked up and put into camp. But when I try to explain to these people, they either won't listen or they hang up. Now, there are many times, and even with my coworkers, it's hard for them to believe because we were talking about this movie Midway. I don't know if some of you have seen this movie Midway. And I told the group, the reason why we won that battle is because we found their aircraft carriers first. And the guy pops up and says, no, we found yours first. So there's one other case. I have a friend of mine, Japanese American, that's married to a Caucasian girl, blonde, blue-eyed. And one of the secretaries there came to me and said, did you know he's married to an American? I said, I'm married to an American too. And it's very difficult for her to believe. I think this is the whole problem. Once the people understand, because they don't want to give us any reparation because they probably think that we were supporting the war and I keep telling the people I had nothing to do, absolutely nothing to do with the country of Japan. And so far as the reference to this theme here at the church, I have never found any document ever where the church ever opposed the evacuation. But in many, many instances I have read where the churches have helped the evacuees get out of camp, support them in college funds, and in many of the books, some of the evacuees have been very grateful for the people of the church. Now, if the church members want to support us in our cause, I think they should write to the congressman, because it would either be this month or next month that we will have this bill in Congress. And I'm sure that Congress would like to hear from everyone how they feel about this issue. I've talked to Bruce Ventel, the 4th District Congressman, about this. And he felt that, yes, there should be something done. He feels that giving a monetary compensation to individuals is not right. He felt maybe that there could be some sort of funds given to the Japanese community. Now, I would go along with that too, but I asked him, the Japanese community here in the Twin Cities, we would be asking for $1 million. And right away, he kind of leaned back a little bit. So we have a program here called the Nikkei Project, which means Japanese Americans, and we have programs for our senior citizens. Now, this program is funded strictly by the Japanese community. We get donations up to about $3,000 a year to run this program. We don't have any place to meet. We have to rent a place. And I think it would help the Japanese community if we could get some kind of funding for our project, for the senior citizens and for myself 20 years from now. But if the church members would like to support this bill, it would be called the Redress Bill for the Japanese Americans. I'm sure the congressman would love to hear from you and would appreciate your support. Thank you.
Our last speaker is a surprise because she's not listed on the program. I wrote to May, who lives in Madison, as some of you have now heard, and I said, I'm having this conference, May. You can be our house guest if you will decide to come. I thought, no way will she come, drive all that way. May is now a widow. How can she do it all by herself? But lo and behold, she got the letter 2-3 days later. A letter came. I'm reordering my whole schedule. I'll be there. What can I do? May was born in Seattle, Washington. She was one of those who graduated in the mid-30s, a young Nisei gal with a music major. Where could she get a job? Her roots are in the United Methodist Church, but I think maybe she'll share some of this with you. She felt perhaps, like most of us who perhaps look different might feel, some other vocation should be explored. And so she decided to go to Japan as a missionary. And she'll tell her story. But after staying there for a few years, I think she just lucked out. She came back to the United States just before World War II broke out. I see some of my students, and when I tell them World War II, I write the dates down. And I say, you don't have to memorize those dates, but have a time frame, just like you remember your boyfriend, your girlfriend's birthday. And so I sort of sneak in a few dates. May came back just shortly before the war broke out, and so she was able to come back, find a mate whom I met before he passed away, and married and settled down in Seattle. But lo and behold, of course, you've heard the story. The war erupted. And so she was relocated to a place close to Washington in Idaho. And I have here Dr. Murphy, who's going to be on the program tomorrow, who lived close to that area, May. A lot of these speakers are making new friends today because there are others who are interested in their experience. And May will share with us what she and her husband did, what the church did for her, perhaps. She moved to Madison from Chicago, from the camps in 1943. And you don't know this. You have been a role model for me. And tomorrow, amongst the guests who come to Augsburg, will be another role model, Mrs. Gladys Brooks. And someone here, Mrs. Jean Moorhead, has also played a tremendous influence in my life. Me?
I didn't realize that I'd be speaking to you this evening, but I'm very happy to participate. I was in Seattle, Washington, where World War II broke out. I was leading a choir of 56 voices, and we were practicing the Christmas numbers of the Messiah. And we were practicing very, very hard when one of the boys came running in the back door, says, "We've been bombed." And he was one of the comics of the choir, and I said, "Come on, settle down, we got a lot to do." He says, "You don't believe me? Well, come on down and listen to it over the radio." So off went a half a dozen boys, and of course it was true, and the choir just fled like this in 2 seconds, and fled in all directions. Suddenly realized then and there that we were at war. We were going to be victims. Our parents were going to be considered enemy aliens. My father was picked up that night by the FBI's, as all Japanese leaders of the community, and all the communities were instantly at that night and periodically for quite some time after it, leaving my mother and my brothers. Fortunately, in our family, I have 4 brothers. The one was in high school, one was in college, and the other 2 were through. And they were trying to help my father run the fish wholesale business. And by that time I was married. My husband's family had a huge laundry employing about 60 people. And all that had to be cared for. And we knew the trauma of this kind would be very difficult for a high school teenager. So we scraped up whatever money we could get, gave them the family car, and told them to get up. And they left. We didn't know where they were going or anything. And my brother-in-law had a family living in Pullman, Washington, so we thought that was a pretty good place to go. In the meantime, we negotiated to get a job in Spokane. My husband and I could not leave. My husband was a public accountant, a certified public accountant, was helping all the the women whose husbands were all picked up, run their grocery stores, their hotels, all the restaurants and everything. They were left helpless. They had known nothing about the business. The bank accounts were all frozen. The safes were sealed. And my husband, being an accountant, the only gracious thing he could do was to help. So he helped them untangle the mess so that the family could live and get some money unfrozen from the assets that were frozen. Doing that kind of work, we could not leave. So we stayed to the very last, and we went through the evacuation. In the meantime, my family got a job for my husband, being an accountant. Accountants during the war years were very much in demand, with a firm in Spokane. But if the war had gone bad, the second 500 mile was being thought of to be evacuated. So why bother sending us to Spokane to go through the same program again? So instead of saying yes and no, they just hemmed and hawed, passed the buck from one office to the other. So we had to go through. We went through camp, and I'm not regretting that we went, because I had an experience that I would have not wanted to miss. Being a Nisei, I was with it. We went to camp in Puyallup, Washington, and then on to Minidoka in Twin Falls. My husband was a captain a contingent of 500 that was moved from Puyallup to Twin Falls in one of these old dilapidated railroad trains, and it was quite an experience. Our experience in camp was similar to many that you've heard, but for my husband and I, we were already through school, we were established in business, and I, with my music background, we were immediately put to work to keep up the morale of the people in this community of 10,000. And my job was with the community activities to keep up the morale in any form, and my specialty being music. And so I organized a choir of 100 voices, quartets, string trios, record concerts, community, sing whatever you want to say to keep the people going. We had an athletic department, entertainment department, craft department, music department, clubs in which WWII, Girl Scout, Boy Scout, you name it, they were all brought in to help keep the morale of the people. So we had no time to sit around and mope or to even think. I don't know when I worked as hard. Some of the older nieces took the leadership because some things had to be done. We couldn't sit around to argue if it was right, wrong, or what. We plunged in because we were asked to keep a community of 10,000 with minimum amount of Caucasian staff. You know it takes a tremendous amount of organization. Our hospitals were staffed, our teachers were staffed. But it took time, but we eventually did get it, and some of us went in there to do that kind of work, for which we were criticized from both sides. And you may be well aware that there were many in camp who had very pro-Japanese tendencies and pointed the fingers at few of the leaders. In some camps, they were badly beaten up, and you know the history. There were violence. And fortunately, in our camp, we had a couple of men in the administrative staff who came and took the job because of the whole thing being so wrong. This was be there. They had YMCA background with Quaker background, and you know the understanding of our Quaker people who always come forth. And it was a privilege for me to work with someone like that in that capacity, who closed the books on the government orders and did whatever was as humane as possible. There are many who may not think so, but I have seen it in operation. And it was a rare privilege for me, having a choir of 10,000, and to dare to sing, Lord God omnipotent reigneth, even behind barbed wire fence. And it was a Christmas that I'll never forget. We went caroling from one end of the camp to the other in 3 army trucks, open army trucks, in 10 below zero. And it was a real experience. Somehow or another, that star that shone that night seemed even brighter to me, and I shall never forget that. And young people participated, have said so. A year after that, many of them wrote from the battlefields where they were serving on the Italian front or down in the southeast Pacific, telling me what those days meant to me, that they can have the courage and to sing all those carols that were very meaningful. Life to them became very real. And the faith that I had given to me by my father and my mother, who were Methodist converts before they even came to this country, has always been the sustaining power for me to meet these adversities. And God has a marvelous way of turning some of the world's worst circumstances into something that could be worthwhile. And this is the way I look at it. Yes, we talk of reparations. It was wrong, very definitely wrong, when no trials or incarceration was given. When people came out, with the FBI and the Secretary of State came out with a broad statement that there's been absolutely no sabotage. People did not hear it. The war hysteria was so great. Even some of our churches did make an attempt, because I know some who have, but they were not heard. The hysteria of war was tremendously great. I can even relate you a story. There were some of our Nisei boys in our U.S. Army who were patrolling the coast. It was near Astoria. The story actually happened. Depending on the commanding officers, some of them were discharged. but some of them were not. And one night, this Japanese Nisei boy was patrolling, and there was a light in a farmhouse. And he went up to the door and knocked at the door to ask them to please turn the light because there was complete blackout on our coast. And the farmer opened the door, and he said, "My God, the Japs have landed," and ran right out the back door. So you could see the tremendous fear that was there. And it is in the midst of all this hysteria that we have lived through it. And I am indebted to the Quaker people and some of my personal Christian friends to be where I am today. When the job in Spokane we could not get to, and the interesting part was the commanding officer of the American Legion vouched to be our sponsor. So we were kind of sorry we couldn't be there. But anyway, we couldn't wait too long. So some of our close friends connected with the YMCA wrote to the National, and National YMCA created a job for my husband to come out to. And I took a job with the American Field Service in a Laird Community House, which is a center for Polish community in near north side of Chicago. By both of us having a job and a place to live, we were permitted to leave. This was early in March of 1943. And so, but at that time, we had to pay our own way out. So we had a bus ride from from Minidoka all the way to Chicago, stopping off at Lincoln. So from the minute we got to Chicago, the National White people said, "We just created a job. If you find anything better, you feel free to go." In the meantime, Mr. Maddox of Ronald Maddox and Associates in Madison, Wisconsin, was in desperate need of an experienced accountant. His accountants were being taken up either by the government or the Army, and leaving him stranded, and he could not be training new ones, and he wanted an experienced accountant. And someone had whispered in his ear that there was one in Chicago. If you're interested, why don't you call him down there? So he called down the line, and my husband came up for an interview and got a job. And he came up immediately. We left camp in March of 1943. We had been in camp only about 10 months, but we were both very busy. And I could not leave my work because I was in the middle of the summer work in the settlement house, and I did not come up to Madison until September of that year. Before we were in our apartment, upstairs of a duplex, which we were very fortunate to get. The reason we got it was because we had no family at the time, and so we got the apartment. Before we knew anything about it, the minister of the First Methodist Church of Madison, the director of the Christian education, and a layman was at our door to welcome us. And we didn't know a soul in Madison. Before that, when we landed in Chicago, we had a similar experience. And I'm bringing this story up tonight because this is the Hennepin Avenue Church. Your former pastor, Harold Roop, was one that welcomed us to Chicago. We had been told if you'd ever go to Chicago, go down to Central Church and get acquainted with Harold Roop. Well, we did because we were living in their downtown area. And he welcomed us, and we had a warm experience, helping us to regain our faith in the church. Because there were days in camp where we thought, where are our churches? You know, we couldn't help but feel desolated at times. So Harold Roop welcomed us, and we attended the Central Church from March to June, and of course the Central Church had no services in the summer. The delightful thing was that every Sunday after the sermon, a group of us would go out and have lunch together with him, and he'll say, "Now, I've preached to you this morning. Now you've preached back to what he had preached." So we had some delightful arguments and some, discussions back, and bringing us very, very close. And when we found out that we were going to Madison, he said, "Now, May and you all," and that was my husband's name, "get associated with the church and get started. I think you'll find that you'll regain yourself in many ways." And I'm sure he was the one that took the minister at the First Methodist Church in Madison to welcome us. So that's been our story. So we are deeply, deeply indebted to the fellowship of our Christian friends wherever we've gone. We've been in Madison ever since. My husband, a job that you all started as just an accountant, turned out to be a partnership, and it's a marvelous place to bring up our two children and to benefit all the education. I feel as I look back on my wartime experience, I am where I am today because of the supreme sacrifice, a complete sacrifice, I must say, of both my parents and my husband's parents. The 50 years or 60 years that they have toiled hard in this country completely went down the drain. It's an absolute loss. No monetary money could never replace. But they left us a legacy of love and service, that which we are fortunate to have, that makes it possible to face. And I feel very fortunate in that. The experience is wrong, and I just hope it never happens again. I will go to my utmost to see. And there has been repercussions of it already in the offerings. You remember when the Iranian situation came up, I heard many remarks within my hearing. He says, put all the Iranians behind barbed wire fence. I said, here we go again. Things like that, it does not take much. It takes many people with strong conviction to be able to help. We are facing the Salvadorian question today, and you probably know what's going on there. Our churches are responding, and I give them credit. We as individuals need to respond, be more sensitive to the needs of people in flight, because there has never been a time in the history of the world where we have as many uprooted people as we have now. It doesn't take much to look, and some of them are landing on our shores. How are we responding to them as fellow Christians? That's a question I love. And I give my experiences that I've been gives me more strength than I could be of any instrument to function in any way. I feel it is my Christian duty. And thank you for the privilege of being here tonight.
Thank you, May. I know you've been all sitting. If you would like to stand, you could. And I thought I would allow about 5-10 minutes for questions. I know that some respond to certain kinds of remarks. And since this is a sort of panel symposium kind of format, perhaps you would like to ask some questions. But since you've been sitting, would you like to stand a minute or two, and then we'll sit and maybe dismiss in about 10-15 minutes. I'd like to take a few questions. You may direct them at whoever you wish. If you would make your question short, that would be more helpful, and I'll sort of repeat it so that it will go into the microphone. Tim? To very briefly rephrase it, are Japanese Americans prepared to share their experience with the college community and other places, since in sociology we do study about minority and race relations? Would anyone care to respond to that?
Sociology.
Gladys?
Well, I think that this has been going on for some time, ever since, at least that I'm aware of, since the evacuation and relocation. At least I get calls to ask what is going on with the Japanese American. But I think at the present time, well, in the last 20, 30 years, I think there's been a opportunity for many of the Japanese Americans to consider their the problems of identity. And I think that they have come around knowing who they are. It's not only because of the blacks of that black identity, but I think that ever since the evacuation and relocation, I think that they've become very, very aware of who they want to be, whether they're Japanese, on the one hand, to what extent they want to hang on to their heritage on the one hand, and on the other hand, be also pluralistic in the sense of sharing some of the arts that have become very popular. I'm reminded of the fact that in the post-World War II period, in the 50s, in the late 40s and the 50s, there was a flurry of Broadway plays, for example, that at least to the American audience, considerable interest, and I think this is partly due to the fact that the soldiers came back from overseas, from the occupation duties, and there was a great interest. And since then, it's died down, but I think through the 50s, and then we went through the university students' concerns about the establishment and all that. And I think that the Nisei, the Japanese Americans, the second generation at least, have become very aware of themselves. And I think now some of us are concerned with the third generation, our children, and some of the sansei, in sociology, there are examples of the Jews and some of the other ethnic minorities that very often the third generation become very, very interested in their cultural heritage because they've been away for quite a while, especially when the second generation have been kind of ambivalent and marginal. Then the third generation have not had direct socialization about their cultural heritage. Instead, like someone mentioned on the panel, that for their children to question them about the relocation experience and why this was done in the United States, I think that considering such questions, some sansei I know have become interested to the extent of taking Far Eastern Studies courses and even going to Japan for study.
Thank you, Gladys. Any other questions? I think in the audience there are some students who came over from Augsburg, future teachers. I think social studies units in the high schools and both in the elementary do now have a consciousness that we should be aware of these things, how other ethnic groups are treated. Many Caucasians are adopting children of different ethnic groups, and now I think there will be more of a concern that this kind of hurt does not come about. And that was one of the things that my husband did pose to me. He said, you know, if there's a war with Burma, remember, things could happen. And I'm always conscious of that. Any other questions? We have in the group some sansei. We have, we've been talking in these terms, Issei, Nisei, a lot of Nisei, sansei, the third generation, now in Hawaii and on the West Coast, we have the Yansei. So these are terms I hope you will go out and sort of throw around since you're the experts with these terms. But I hope you've enjoyed this evening. Please come tomorrow, and thank you so much to our speakers. You've shared with us a lot of personal things, and I'm sure we all empathize and hope it will never happen again. And if it does, the church and community will respond. Thank you for coming.